Let's see here. I want to talk a little bit. What am I talking about? Oh, yeah. We're going to finish the series today. If you're a guest with us, we're thrilled that you're here. We are going to finish up a series. I feel like I'm reiterating a lot of what they said, and it's not because I don't trust them. It's because I planned to say it. I didn't know they were going to say it, so now I'm going to say it anyway. We're going to finish up this series called The God Confusion. It's the series that we've been working through for 7 weeks, which is kind of unprecedented for us to go that long because most of our attention spans don't last that long. But we felt like God was asking us to move into some content that was uncomfortable. I know for me, atypical to the way I'm bent and wired, I think for us. And yet at the same time, we felt like God was asking us to engage our community in having this conversation, that's candid and honest and hopefully real and hopefully humble. We weren't for a second thinking that we wanted to be the last word on this subject, and yet nonetheless, we felt like there were these relevant questions like, is there such a thing as truth, and can it be known, and what about agnosticism, and what about atheism, and why is the search for faith so hard? Questions like that. Little light stuff, So we're going to finish that up this morning by asking this question, don't all religions lead to the same God? Aren't all paths the same? Some variation of pluralism, essentially, is what we're talking about. Before we do that, though, I just want to acknowledge the fact, because I'm feeling a little insecure. Oh, yeah, by the way, Lindsay, congratulations. Capital got third place at State AA Soccer Girls, so good job, Lindsay. Yoo-hoo! I was supposed to say that at the beginning. Anyway, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that we haven't opened the Bible a whole lot through this series. And I recognize that. I, like you, am uncomfortable with that. If you're uncomfortable with it, that's probably a good thing. Here's why we haven't, though. Our hope was to engage people, both who have had faith in the past and have since lost it, people who have never had faith, and people whose faith was slipping through their finger like slime, and to help them get a grip on that. And though it's a little uncomfortable for us as Christ followers to admit that, in my mind, it's silly to treat the Bible as authoritative with people who don't see it as authoritative. You follow that? So in my mind, it's authoritative. It defines, hopefully, I'm not perfect, but right, it's the model by which we try to live. It's the model by which we know God. And yet, for lots of people, it's not. And so for this season, we haven't been spending a lot of time wrestling with God via the text for those very candid reasons. And yet next week, that culture is going to shift. We're going to jump back into the text because we're going to ask this question, what was Jesus' creed? And to be sure, these two series coinciding are intentional, prayerful on our part. Like this conversation for your friends and family and no matter where people are on their spiritual journey that's very culturally relevant, we hope, the God confusion, and then to just unapologetically move into, okay, so who is Jesus and what was his creed? And to that end, it's really our privilege, you guys, to have Dr. Bruner, Dan Bruner, he won't let you call him doctor, Dan Bruner here with us next week. Like if you were to ask me, Adam, two most influential professors at grad school at George Fox, without hesitation, I'd say Stephen Delamarter and Dan Bruner. Remarkable men. The great thing about them is both of them lead the local church as well as our professors. So they're not these hoity-toity intellectuals. They're people grinding it out in the local church and yet at the same time helping people trying to think through church and God and things like that at grad school. Dr. Bruner is Oxford educated. He'll have his bow tie on, I assure you, and his Oxford socks. But he also just lost his wife within the last couple years to like a 17-year battle with brain cancer, So his feet are firmly on the ground, and yet he's passionate about Jesus. And what I've asked him to talk about is Christology. So I say all that to say that I realize that we're a church of once or twice a month. For many of you, sometimes 3 and sometimes 4, whatever. And I don't want to speak to that. I think that's part of the culture of permission that we've tried to create. But to that end, I couldn't encourage you enough to be here next week if you can. Because obviously, like Dr. Bruner is not going to be here every week, and I assure you it'll be remarkable. And this week you're stuck with me. So next week, Dr. Bruner, this week you're stuck with me. Davey's going to do some carving. Do you know Davey? Yeah, all you know is Davey's back at this point, but he does have a very cool beard, one that I'm emulating in my own life, though I don't have the sideburns. Okay, so this question, don't all paths lead to the same God? What about pluralism? To get inside of that, I want you to imagine the situation of a Philistine woman alive, let's say, 3,000 years ago. And in doing so, what I want us to get at here initially is how much different her search for faith was than ours. That, 10 years into the 21st century, our search for faith is quite unlike most people in the history of the planet. And to kind of make that contrast, just think about this Philistine woman who, for all intents and purposes, really had one choice in her faith journey. She could be a Philistine, right? I mean, sure, she knew there were other nations out there. She knew there were other countries. But she also knew that those other countries were her country's enemies. She knew about the Amalekites. She knew about the Egyptians. She knew about the Hittites. She knew about these people. She also knew that they had their own religion. But she also knew that those people were her people's enemies. And their gods were her God's enemies. And thus, while we live in a culture that compels us in a myriad of directions in our spiritual journeys, she lived in a culture that really gave her one option. This is made all the more true by the fact that she lived in a polytheistic culture, and polytheistic gods are very regional. In a polytheistic culture, the right God to worship changes as you move geographic locations. So literally, knowing which God to worship is as simple as knowing where you're at. Like when in Rome, when in Rome, they would say, well, then you worship the Roman gods. And also think about how little history she had behind her. We have the internet, we have vast resources, we have thousands of years of church history for those of us that follow Christ. She had her mom and her grandma, a village priest perhaps, which means she wasn't having to deal with stories of, religious scandal 200 years ago. She didn't have to deal with studies coming out of universities that were unpacking the detrimental effects of her faith upon adolescents 0 to 10 years old. She didn't have to deal with that stuff. She didn't have to deal with the fact that 5 generations ago the head priest was a jerk and that he stole a bunch of money. My point is that in her experience, it was very easy for her faith to be portrayed as very perfect, very pure, right? She didn't have to deal with science. Now, I'm a fan of science, so please don't misunderstand that. But nonetheless, if the priest said that the sky is blue because broccoli's green, that didn't go contested. That was just acknowledged as true. Like particularly as it pertains to the natural world, there were no authorities calling into question the findings of her religion. There weren't people who'd been wounded by her spirituality, who were now hated the idea of spirituality, and who had set out to explain things that the supernatural otherwise explains in non-supernatural ways. She didn't have to deal with that. And even her social experiences, like where you and I are surrounded by people with whom we disagree and hopefully in love, her social experiences only confirmed further what she believed, right? Like she did not go to the grocery store and buy a gallon of milk from a clerk who disagreed and had a different religion than she did. She didn't study chemistry at the university from a professor who believed differently than she did. She didn't work for a boss who hated her form of spirituality and mocked her and made fun of her for it. She didn't jog or work out with some gals after work, all of whom had different views on spirituality, and she certainly didn't return home to a husband with whom she disagreed spiritually. Everything about her social experiences said to her, we're right. We are right. Which really means her experience couldn't be more different than ours, right? She didn't choose to be a Philistine any more than you and I chose what city we were born in. Which means she didn't deal with this trilemma. And it's really a trilemma that we've worked through throughout this series. The trilemma goes like this, that there are certain forces that compel us to a particular faith. I think the way we said it, some forces pull us to a particular commitment to a particular faith. And yet second, there are some forces that pull us to have an equal tolerance for all faiths. And then third, there are forces, that pull us away from having any faith commitment at all. She didn't have to deal with that. To be a Philistine meant you're a Philistine religiously, socially, and everything. And I think, again, this is really what we've tried to deal with in these series, honestly, candidly, and yet in a way that wasn't watertight of there's these forces. And this morning, as we wrap it up, I just want to deal with that middle one. That there are some forces that pull us having an equal tolerance for all faiths. It's the question, right? Don't all paths lead to the same God? And it is a heavy, heavy question, isn't it? It's the one that we're most eager to avoid, the one that we most quickly look like bigots when we deal with. I mean, it's the question of, do we really have to say that there's only one right religion? Isn't that arrogant? Isn't that mean? Unkind, dishonest historically, simple-minded? Do we really have to say there's really only one right faith? Why can't we just, shop from the global collection of religions and the ways you and I grocery shop? You probably don't think of this, but hopefully you will after today. When you go to the grocery store, as 21st century Americans, you have under one roof a collection of foods that literally cover all kinds of societies, all kinds of cultures, all kinds of people groups, the entire planet. And so you pick and choose your food as it suits your palate and your lifestyle. So no one makes fun of you if you have salmon and chips and guacamole. Two cultures colliding, right? But you can do that. And this is really the question. And you know, probably the most pertinent issue on this is, why can't we just shop our faith and grab things that appeal to us uniquely? When you get into this, doesn't it kind of make you wish you were the Philistine? Kind of be simpler, wouldn't it? You just had one option. And yet, from another vantage point, I would say that the advantages of the Philistine are themselves imaginary, aren't they? I mean, if you're looking for a faith that's difficult to doubt, easy to believe, then the Philistine's position is to be admired, right? But if you're looking for a faith that's true, that's tested, that's thoughtful, that's good, that's tried, that's optional, that's chosen, you know, then as difficult as our situation is, isn't ours actually the desired situation? Complex though it is, aren't we at this unique, awesome place in human history where we're not told, we get to pick? Now, so pluralism, we're going to talk about it. Let's define it just so that we kind of all are on the same general page. For our purposes, let's just say that pluralism simply says that all paths lead to the same God. Really what pluralism does is it takes the viewpoint of a religiously free constitutional democracy. Are those for syllables? I did not write that sentence. I stole it. Right? But what we're taking is the viewpoints of a religiously free constitutional democracy, and we're making them our own personal viewpoints. So religiously free constitutional democracy says we are not going to give preference to one religion over another. We are going to allow spirituality, religion, whichever term you prefer, we're going to allow there to be an open marketplace where they can have dialogue and they can conversate, but government and tax dollars are not going to prop anyone up over the other. And what pluralism essentially then does is says, for me personally, I'm going to take that same viewpoint. I'm going to say I don't give preference one over the other. And ultimately then it says that it doesn't really matter what you believe so long as you believe it with sincerity. Now, like if God was sleeping and there was one thing that I could write into the text while he was sleeping, if he wasn't paying attention for a moment, and there was one thing I could add to orthodoxy, wouldn't it be this? Wouldn't it simplify life on so many levels if we could just go, yeah. God is the hound of heaven, and through a myriad of religions he's pursuing God, and everybody gets him through those different religions. Wouldn't you write that in if you could? And yet, I think if we did, what we would quickly learn is we've just contradicted the entire text. And I don't just mean the Bible. We could talk about the Quran. The moment we write that in, we've really made illogical some of the most historic, sacred faiths on the planet. It doesn't jive together. You could say it this way, that pluralism is both illogical and it's impractical. And I know that's harsh, and we'll bring it around in the end, but let's just talk about the fact that, in my view, it's illogical. It's illogical because if pluralism is true, then God either lies or else is forgetful. I mean, think about this. He told Muhammad, people need to worship at Mecca. It's really important. He told Jesus, doesn't matter where you worship. It's about who you worship and how you worship. Got to have a forked tongue. It's a little sarcastic, a little sinister, but really. He told the Jews, you can't eat pork, but you can eat chicken and beef. And he told the Hindus, all meat's immoral. I mean, is God forgetful? Did he forget what he told one people and then told somebody else something else, and like a bad manager, he's got these contradictions and he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth all the time? He's told some people, some spiritualities, men fall lower in the hierarchy. He's told other spiritualities, that's ridiculous. No way. Complementary, for sure. The same, no. Equal, yeah. He's told some spiritualities, there are some humans that are less valuable than others. We know this in the form of the caste system most readily in our culture. He's told others, and here's where I am proud of the Apostle Paul, like, no way. People are people. They're made in God's image. Equal. So at the point at which God tells one religion, if pluralism is true, the point at which he tells one religion, you can eat this and another you can't, I don't know about you, but he's kind of lost me. It gets a little ridiculous. I would say that if pluralism is true, then God plays favorites. Because he's told one spirituality that in the face of conflict, turn the other cheek. He's told the other they can convert with the sword. I don't know about you, but I think one group has an advantage over the other. If pluralism is true, then religions lie, if we're going to be honest and candid. All of them, or at least, like 99% of them lie. Because religions themselves, they don't claim to be a way, do they? They claim to be the way. You'd be hard-pressed, and I'm sure you could find them, but to find a religion itself that affirms pluralism, most of them don't say, like, we're a way to God. We say we're the way, and that's not just Christianity, that's Islam, that we could just go down the list. Which means that if pluralism is true, then religions lie. Which means that if pluralism is true, then okay, it's true, but it's also false, which is illogical. It is illogical, so I can't make logical sense of it, but I'm going to try. Because if pluralism is true, then all religions, they are a way to God. And yet all religions don't claim to be a way, they claim to be the way, which means pluralism is false, which is illogical. Now, here's the part where I look like the religious bigot, right? Ready to go to John 14:6 and go, see, Jesus. I don't want to be confused on this fact. I love living in a pluralist society, don't you? I mean, and even if you say you don't, I know you do, because some of your best friends don't follow Jesus, and you kind of like it that way. Like every time there's a Christian, buffet, or what do they call those things that we do once a year, where everybody brings food and you don't know whose germs are in it, and what are those called? Potluck, yeah. We would all be at every one of them, right? Like, I like you, I love living in a society where I disagree with a lot of the people with whom I get to live life with. I love living in this. Frankly, for me, what I love about Helena is, small though it is diverse in so many ways. It's awesome, isn't it? In fact, further, and this might be uncomfortable for you, and we can talk afterwards, but I'm going to argue that the pluralist society is a creation of Jesus. That we could trace back this idea of pluralist societies, not pluralist individualism, but pluralist societies, back to Jesus. Because if anybody seemed to carve the road of a society where you interact with people you disagree, it was Jesus, was it not? I mean, he was raised in a culture where you were very clearly told, here's the lines. Anyone who disagrees, don't associate with them. Don't go to the other side of the lake, not because the fishing's not good over there. Don't go to the other side of the lake because the Greeks live there. There's Greco-Roman cities there. Don't associate with these people. They're outcasts. Don't associate with these women. They're adulterers. I mean, Jesus had very clear lines drawn in the sand. Certainly don't go to Greek theater because it's vile and evil. And though Jesus probably would have agreed with the immorality of a lot of it, there's evidence that, he went there. He used their vocabulary. The word hypocrisy is a Hollywood term, if you will, of his day, which is evidence that while he was being told, stick with the people who you agree with, he was going, no way. In fact, some scholars and historians, they go a step further. They don't just say that Jesus hung out at theater, or at least was aware of it, but that as a young man, he helped build one of those cities. I want to show you a few pictures from our last time in Israel. That's the modern day of Nazareth, modern day city of Nazareth. In the foreground is what is that place called where you take stones and you make stuff out of them? A quarry. Yeah, exactly. Now, it doesn't look like a quarry to you, but here's what's going on, and we're not going to go to the next picture just yet, but the historians are starting to grapple with this. Nazareth was within, an hour's walking distance of a place called Sapori, which was one of these Greco-Roman cities that had Greco-Roman theater, one of these cities that Jews were not told to go to, were told not to go to, supposedly. And yet, they find this quarry right there, right by Nazareth. Jesus, we're told in the Gospels, was a tekton, often translated carpenter. We often picture Jesus with his nails and his pine, building kitchen tables with long legs. There was no pine, there were no nails. Jesus was probably a stonemason. He made stuff out of rocks, not out of wood. He carved pillars out of these quarries. Some would say that the men of Nazareth played a very key role in building Vegas. Sapori. Next picture. There's just a picture, that leads them to this conclusion of it's a quarry. Next picture. I can't believe I'm telling this story, but I'm telling it. So they are also in a quarry spot. But okay, so when we went to Israel this last time, Johnny's already laughing because he was with us. There was a group of us, 20-somethings from this community that we were part of, and this is awkward, but you need to know this. There was 4 single gals on the trip with us. So you need to know that, 4 single gals. So at one point, we're in this quarry right near Nazareth. We're walking to Sapori, and Marty, our guide, our teacher on this trip, he was going to try to demonstrate a particular Jewish festival involving virgin women and white dresses and red grapes. And actually what they're standing in is a wine press. And so to add 3 dimensions to his illustration, he said to our group of about, 15 or so, 4 of whom are single gals, okay, I need 3 virgins. So Courtney and Michelle, the one on the right there is actually Kyle Ball's sister. Courtney and Michelle jumped down into the wine press. The word here is awkward, right? The word here is we are a culture of broken people and there is no shame, but this is awkward, right? And we're just going to get through it. But Michelle, the gal on the left, who is both brilliant and ditzy all at the same time, she, in a moment of brilliance, said, "Oh, come on, there's got to be more than 2 of us." And the other 2 gals just crawled into a hole. And there's really no purpose other than to talk about Jesus and his pluralistic cultures. Next slide. Here is Sapori. Those pillars, perhaps, came from Jewish men from Nazareth. Next slide. This is just a random one-breasted Amazon woman tile floor that I thought you might enjoy to see. I don't know why I picked that, other than to demonstrate that's classic evidence of a Greco-Roman floor, because Jews, no graven images, no pictures of people. Within a couple hours, max, walking distance of Jesus' hometown. So we kind of got to shift our thinking here, is what I'm getting at. I love living in a pluralistic culture. I think Jesus is largely responsible for it. And yet I think we also have to acknowledge that on a personal level, it's pretty illogical, and I would add it's impractical. Yes, religions often teach much of the same stuff. They also teach very different stuff. Different religions offer very different paths to very different God concepts. And though it's easy to lay it out and go, no, they don't, they do. Different religions teach different stuff about your value as a human being, God's desire for you relationally, and what your purpose is on this planet. To say that they all generally agree is, it's silly. Religions offer very different views on life and God and spirituality, which really means this, that the choice you make on this issue of spirituality and religion, it matters. Like, your life will end up in different places depending on what you choose here. And we can pretend that that's not true, and really probably what we're doing is taking for granted Jesus' influence upon our culture, whether you agree with him or not. Different spiritualities lead down different paths. I know a college gal who hangs out here who, when she left for Carroll, her parents' faith tanked. They went from this family that was very involved in their local church and were there with regularity to now she goes home and her parents make fun of her when she reads her Bible, and they don't go to church, but they're like, "Let's go because you're here." And she's like, "I don't want to go because you're here." So she's a 20-year-old gal trying to make her faith her own at college, and she has having to do that alone because now her parents are like on a different island than her on this issue. And then she made the decision in the last month or so that on December 26th, she's jumping on a plane and she's going to Haiti on a medical mission trip. Now, my point is this. You don't just end up there. Like, life doesn't just, and I'm not suggesting we should all go to Haiti on a medical mission trip. My point is that is good faith. And you don't just end up there. That's a very intentional, direct path. That's a destination. I know a gal who, single and advanced in life, I'm not going to tell your age, and made a decision recently to stop having sex with her boyfriend because of what she feels like Jesus is talking to her about. Now, I don't have to tell you that, like, you don't just end up making that decision. Like, not all paths lead to that decision. That is a very direct view on God and herself and her worth and her soul and her heart. I know a family that's in their 50s, I hope, I think. Let's call them their 40s. And they have an empty nest. He's home 2 days a week. And they're here, both services, 45 Sundays a year, because they so value teaching your kids about Jesus that, they have 2 days a week together, and they're spending half of one of those days here because they want to teach your kids about Jesus. I'm not suggesting that all empty nesters should be teaching kids about Jesus. I'm just trying to point out, I don't have to tell you like that. You don't just set out, you don't get married at 20 and end up in your 50s making a decision of that magnitude in just any way. That's a very direct thing. I know a couple, they were in their 40s. Their fourth daughter was nearing the final stages, and they decided that God was talking to them about adopting urban kids, bringing brokenness into their home. And, the dad's 49 now, and he's got a baby at home. And mom's, she was done with the baby gig for over a decade. Now she's back in it. Their income necessarily had to double. Their family vehicle is a 15-passenger van. That seals the deal for me, right? You don't just end up there. The choices we make spiritually, they matter. Pluralism might be, it's a miss. It might be a near miss, but it's a miss. And then there's this. Okay, how you doing? Can we trade? Look at that. Then there's this, you guys. When we talk about pluralism, I'm well aware of the fact that we've really only touched on half of the tension, right? Because the other half of the tension is, what about the Philistine woman 3,000 years ago? The other half of the tension is, what about the 16-year-old gal who's been raised in a strictly Muslim culture and she's never even heard of Christ? What about her? What about that geographically isolated people group in Northeast Asia? And then it gets even more personal, doesn't it? What about your great-great-grandpa, who worked his dogs off? He didn't have time to read books. And you sit there and you go, man, I'm convinced if he'd heard the gospel as I've heard the gospel, he'd be in. I'm not sure that he's heard that. What about your deceased dad, who you're not sure that he ever set foot in a church? Pluralism is personal, and I hope what you're hearing from me is, Christ, there's no better candidate for you to follow than Jesus. But it's personal on that level. It's also intensely huge, isn't it? What about you fill in the blank? Really the question we're asking is someone damned if they've never heard the story of the historical Christ and the implications of that? Which is an intense question, right? I will offer a couple comments and then we're going to look at a verse. I think there's good reason to be hesitant to offer matter-of-fact, simplistic comments here. Because Jesus had a habit of telling the people whom he lived his life, that person's in, and everyone in his culture said they were out. Jesus had a habit of flipping the whole thing upside down. He even at one time said the last will be first and the first will be last. So I think we would be wise to hesitate to speak with matter-of-fact opinion on these subjects. But really the question we're asking is, what about Jesus? Is his gospel exclusive? And on this issue, he speaks. John 14:6, he says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Probably no verse more controversial, more painful, more poignant, more true perhaps than this. And so I just want to make a couple observations here, and I'm indebted here to C.S. Lewis and Dallas Willard on what I'm going to say henceforth. First of all, please notice that the exclusivity claim is not tied to Christianity. It's tied to Christ. He is not saying Christianity is exclusive. And my point there is, his point there is, Christianity is cultural, whether we like it or not. It's a human construct to a large degree. He is not saying Christianity is exclusive. He is saying Jesus Christ, I am exclusive. That's a big difference there. Which raises this question in lots of people's heads. And it's a question that C.S. Lewis asked, who is like probably the greatest Christian thinker of the 20th century. It's a question that Dallas Willard's asking today. It's a common question, and it goes like this. Is it possible to know Jesus without knowing his name? Is it possible to understand a God of grace who made you for relationship with him? A God who is trying to rescue you from your brokenness, and yet you can't rescue yourself from your brokenness. You are dependent upon his goodness to get you out of that mess. Is it possible to recognize the gospel without hearing the gospel, in other words? Is it possible to know Jesus without knowing his name? Some guys would say it this way. Is it possible to know Jesus without knowing the historical Jesus? Knowing Christ and the concept, the gospel of Christ, without having heard that there was this guy named Jesus of Nazareth who was born a virgin to Mary in about AD 0, and who died around AD 30. Is it possible to know God, know Christ, and not know the historical Christ? Some would even say it this way. Are there people in heaven, and by heaven I'm referring to, in this instance, life after death, heaven. Are there people in heaven with Jesus who in their lifetime, if you would have said, hey, do you know Jesus? They'd have went, eh? You mean my neighbor next door? Because, well, anyway, right? Are there people there who did not know Jesus' name, and yet knew Jesus, knew the truth, knew the gospel? And one of the texts that guys go to support this, ironically, is John 14:6. Mainly because the first two words, I am. Now, oftentimes we think that, that's like I am an Oscar Mayer Wiener, or I am, Jesus isn't just starting a sentence there. The I am here, Jesus is hearkening up all of the content of the historical, revelatory name of God, I am, that we see in the book of Exodus. Remember Moses said to a guy, to a burning bush, who art thou, right? And he went, I am. I am means this. I know that this is heady, and I promise that we will stop doing this next week. I am means this. The being whose being is dependent upon no other being. When God, and here Christ, identifies himself as the I am, he is saying, I am the self-existent one, the one whose being is dependent upon no other being. And quickly then what he's getting at is his size, how massive he is. When you deal with the name I am, what you're forced to do is reconcile how big God is in comparison with creation. Probably no people are better positioned in the history of humanity to understand how big the cosmos are than us. And yet the I am says, you are not dealing with a small God and a big cosmos. You are dealing with a big God and an otherwise small cosmos. Which means this. The I am is big enough, perhaps, in my view, the I am is big enough to reveal Christ in ways that you and I are entirely unfamiliar with. Like for us in our time, our culture, it's the gospel, and it's the historical gospel. It's the gospel for everybody. It's the historical Christ, undoubtedly. The question really becomes, is the I am big enough to reveal Christ, to reveal the gospel in ways that we are unfamiliar with? You know that there's a book written, I could point you to it. These missionaries, they went to the Philippines and they ended up on this obscure little island and they started telling people the gospel. And the people are like, yeah, got it. And they're like, really? Someone beat us here? Training our whole lives to reach an unreached people group and someone beat us here? They're like, no. And they pointed to the stars. And they systematically explained Christ via the stars to these missionaries. Uncomfortable for us, but there. Someone told me this last week that one of the common conversion stories among Muslims right now is, where did you hear about Christ? In my dreams. That's a God who's big enough to reveal Christ in ways that you and I are unfamiliar with. C.S. Lewis, well, let me just say this and then I'll close with his final thought. Somehow we've got it in our heads that God's job is to keep people out of heaven. That he's like some tyrant that has like this litmus test that people have to pass to get in. I would say that's one of the most grossly unorthodox things we could ever believe about the God of the Bible. Like, God is a big fan of heaven, and he's working really hard to get people in. Now, I'm not suggesting that it doesn't matter what you believe. I'm not suggesting that Christ isn't exclusive. I'm just saying, please understand that God is a big fan of the Christ story, and he wants people to know it far more than you and I do. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Great Divorce. We picked up a few, and you can grab it as you go if you want. They're $10 if you can throw that down, if you can't, whatever. But anyway, The Great Divorce is this book that basically says this. Everybody will be in heaven who can stand being there. God, this is an intense subject. And for some of us, we're thinking of deceased family members on the subject. We're dealing honestly, God, with generations of people who preceded Christ. We're wondering about people groups that he's not accessible to, and yet at the same time, we're trying to stay faithful to your gospel. God, thanks that you're big enough. Thanks for your grace. Thanks that we live at this unique time where we don't just know Christ and know the gospel, we know the historical Christ, and we recognize that that is a really unique privilege that we have. God, we don't want to lay down soft on this issue, but we also don't want to shrink you down to a size that would be embarrassing to you. So would you help us both personally and in the stories that we tell, help us embrace the tension between an exclusive Christ and a God who is able to reveal the gospel in ways that we are unfamiliar with. Pray that people who literally stay up at night wondering about loved ones, that there would be a peace that comes from the trust that they have in you and your goodness and your faithfulness to reveal Christ. It's in Jesus' name we pray.